Hey, this is Hobbyhammer. Today we're going to talk about Warhammer 40,000. What is it? So you've stumbled across Warhammer 40,000, and we need to figure out what it is. To put it simply, Warhammer 40,000 is a tabletop war game created by a company called Games Workshop in the United Kingdom. Games Workshop's been developing the game for more than 30 years. They even have an entire division of the company dedicated just to developing and fleshing out the storyline behind the game. The storyline, as we'll discuss in future videos, far surpasses other franchises like Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones in the sheer amount of detail and volume of content. The game is set in the 41st millennium, in which the Imperium of Man, the quote-unquote good guys, fights against the forces of chaos and various alien races in the Milky Way galaxy. The game is set in our galaxy, in our timeline, but of course about 38,000 years in the future. Now, the setting is described in a term that they've coined as grim dark. Essentially, the galaxy is in ruin. All of the forces are struggling. There are no really good guys. Like I said, the Imperium of Man is the quote-unquote good guys, but as we'll get into, they're very clearly not righteous in any sense of the word. So there are really no good guys, making it a very interesting and very compelling storyline. The game itself, again, is a tabletop war game. But what does that mean? So let's start off by comparing it to chess, which is a game that everybody knows. Now in chess, of course, everything's set on a chessboard, which is a fixed grid, and both players have identical forces in that they all have the same number of pawns. They have 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a king, and a queen. Now, a tabletop war game differs from that in a large number of ways. To begin with, instead of playing on a surface like a chessboard, the game is typically played on a 6x4 foot table that's been created and decorated, so to speak, to look like an actual battlefield with buildings, trees, craters, anything that the players can come up with to immerse themselves and make the board look like an actual battlefield rather than a game board. The forces, again, unlike chess, are not fixed in their content, what they're made out of. If you were to say, I enjoy chess, but I don't like using pawns, what if I could get rid of all of my pawns and instead have 2 queens instead of just 1, and 4 knights, and I don't like bishops, so I'll get rid of those also, and I'll have 3 rooks. Whereas the other player might say, I don't like knights at all. Let's get rid of my 2 knights. Let's get 4 extra pawns because I enjoy using these little pieces. And get rid of all the other rooks and bishops as well, and I'll have 3 queens. So 3 queens, a mass of pawns, and a king. Now, these forces look very different from each other now, which is exactly what happens in Warhammer 40,000, that the players are able to pick and choose what type of units that they want in their force. There is no fixed force for any player to use. In addition to that, there's a number of different factions, and within those factions are many different sub-factions, making it exceedingly unlikely that any player will ever play against another player with an army identical to their own. That essentially in practice and in theory will never happen. The game pieces themselves are models in the sense that they're made out of most often plastic, sometimes resin, sometimes metal. They're hand painted by the players or by somebody that they've convinced to paint them for them. They don't have to be painted, of course. It makes them look nice and again makes the whole experience more immersive, but playing with unpainted models is perfectly acceptable, and quite a few people do, because they are small and can be challenging if you're not inclined to that sort of activity. And again, the forces are chosen and tailored by each player for their own play style. The game itself starts off with deployment, where each player is assigned their portion of the board, called a deployment zone, and they deploy their army in a manner however their rules articulate that they do so, but they can put their pieces for the most part wherever they'd like within their deployment zone, with a few exceptions. And then the players take turns. It's a turn-based game. One turn consists of a movement phase, in which the player moves any of his models that he'd like to, and then a psychic phase, in which the pieces that are capable of casting psychic powers, which are essentially magic, do so. And then there's a shooting phase, in which all the models armed with various ranged weapons shoot the opposing force. A charge phase, in which the forces can charge the opposing units if they're close enough. A fighting phase, in which those two forces that are now in melee combat engage each other. And then a morale phase, in which any unit, both friend and foe, that have taken casualties throughout that turn determine whether or not any of the models within that unit run away. And then it's the other player's turn. And the players take their turns, one after the other, back and forth. And a game typically lasts for 5 to 7 turns. And this typically lasts several hours, depending on the number of units and the size of the game that each player is using. Each size of the force that each player is using. Forces themselves are balanced through points or power level. Power level is a simplified version of points. Points are used most commonly. And a typical game consists of each player with a force of worth 2,000 points is the typical size of the game. Whereas a Space Marine, one of the most iconic individual pieces within the game, is currently valued at 13 points, and so forth. A tank generally runs approximately 100 to 200 points, generally. Much larger war machines, referred to as Titans, are typically 300 to 500 points. And there's various characters ranging from 30 points to several hundred points. There's even aircraft, which generally range from about 100 to 200 points. The outcomes of all of this are determined by the stat lines of the units. Each unit has a fixed or variable, a determined distance in which it can move, which is players use a ruler to measure how far their unit moves rather than a grid like in chess. Ranged weapons have a distance assigned to them that is their range. Again, players use a ruler to determine what of their foes' units are within range. And then the results of those shooting and close combat attacks are determined using dice. Dice, of course, brings in a degree of variability within the game, which chess does not have, and therefore a game of Warhammer 40,000 can never be as perfectly even as chess is designed to be. Whereas chess is regarded as simply one player versus another with no other variables except for the fact that one of them gets to go first. Warhammer 40,000 is one player versus another, but there are a large number of variables that we've already discussed the composition of the forces and, of course, the variability of the dice. And in that sense, luck is a factor in the game. But even with that being the case, there are many tournaments across the world. Some even involve cash prizes. There are leagues, generally in local gaming stores. And there's multiple ways to play the game. Again, the narrative behind the game is incredibly rich, and many players just enjoy immersing themselves within that narrative and play the game in a manner that they don't consider to be competitive in any sense, and just play the game so that they can be within the narrative themselves. There's open play, which essentially removes as many of the rules as reasonable so that players can engage each other without having to worry about making sure that everything is perfectly even or anything like that. And then there's matched play, which is the set of rules that tournaments and leagues typically use. Matched play is the version of the rules that is designed to try and make everything as even and balanced and fair as reasonably possible, given the number of, again, more than 15, possibly about 20 different factions, and then each faction has many different sub-factions within it, and then each sub-faction has a number of units available to them. It can be, of course, quite challenging to keep that number of items balanced compared to each other, but Games Workshop does revise rules consistently and does a very good job, for the most part, of making sure that everything is balanced to the point where the tournaments and the more competitive play is regarded across the world as fair. If anything stands out as being unfair in the sense that maybe it doesn't cost as many points as it should compared to another unit, or a weapon is too effective, or a psychic ability is too effective or not effective enough, etc. The Games Workshop does do a good job of tweaking those rules and those points values to make sure that the game across the board, so to speak, is fair. In future videos, we'll be discussing more in depth the storyline behind the game, as well as the aspects of the hobby, because the game itself is only one piece of the hobby that is Warhammer 40,000. Many people enjoy just reading the countless novels and stories that have fleshed out the narrative. Many people enjoy just painting the models and never even play the game, because the models themselves are so incredibly detailed for the most part. The technology that the company uses has advanced significantly since the 1980s, when they first began developing models and hand sculpting them. The models themselves are so detailed and wonderful that painting the models themselves brings its own joy. And in fact, there are many painting competitions, where painters and artists, which is absolutely what they are, present their works and are judged and win prizes based on how gorgeous their works have been. And then again, there's the actual playing of the game. In future videos, again, we'll expand on all of these aspects of the hobby, and I appreciate you stopping by and checking this channel out. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments or any ideas for future videos, anything you'd like more information on, please comment down below. Like, subscribe, tell a friend. See you around.